6 villages in eastern Dnipropetrovsk changed hands this week, and it was Russian troops walking backward. Ternove, Zaporizhzhye, Novoherohivka, Vorone, Sichneve, Malivka. Ukraine's 425th Assault Regiment, working alongside the air assault forces, cleared the last pockets Russia was holding in that oblast, and Ukrainian military reporting put the figure at 126 square kilometers taken back. North of Lyman, Ukrainian units are cutting into a 20-kilometer Russian salient, and the Institute for the Study of War now confirms Ukraine has liberated ground in that sector. In Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine gained more territory in June than it lost. 3 sectors, 3 directions of travel, all of them pointing the wrong way for Moscow. And none of that is the thing that broke. The thing that broke sits about 1,300 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, in a Bashkir industrial town called Salavat, and it broke on the night of July 13th. Ukrainian drones flew roughly 1,500 kilometers to reach it. What they hit was the last major gasoline-producing refinery in Russia that Ukraine had not already struck this year. The last one. That sentence should land differently than it probably did the first time you read it, because it means the list is finished. Not the campaign, the list. It's July 16th, and the number that matters more than any territorial map you'll see today is 3.91 million. That's how many barrels of crude Russia's refineries processed per day in early July, according to Energy Aspects data cited by Bloomberg. It's the lowest level since 2005. Not since the invasion, since 2005. This is Professor Alex, and if you want the version of this war that runs through balance sheets instead of flags on a map, subscribe, because that's the only version I know how to tell. So let's deal with the front line first, because there's a story circulating right now that Russia has ordered coordinated withdrawals across 4 sectors of the Eastern Front, that commanders have decided forward positions are untenable, that the whole thing is quietly folding. I went looking for it. It isn't there. On July 14th, ISW assessed that Russian forces seized the settlement of Ryazna, southeast of Sumy City, and pushed into central Pokrovka. They advanced in western Kostiantynivka. They advanced southeast of Slovyansk. That's not a retreat. That's an army still moving forward in the places it has chosen to move forward in. And I'm not going to tell you otherwise because a thumbnail would look better if I did. But here's what the same reporting shows, and it's stranger and more useful than a collapse narrative. Russia's net territorial gain for the entire first half of 2026 is 97 square kilometers. 97. Al Jazeera ran the arithmetic against Russia's own stated objective of taking the remaining 20% of Donetsk Oblast by year's end. And at the current rate, that job takes 5,150 days, 14 years. On top of the 12 years Russian-aligned forces have already been fighting for that ground. Sit with that for a second. Not because it's funny, because of what it costs to produce it. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Syrsky, said on July 14th that Russian forces are losing over 400 men killed or wounded for every square kilometer they take in Donetsk. ISW's own theater-wide calculation runs higher, around 1,298 casualties per square kilometer seized or infiltrated in June of this year. The two figures use different methods and cover different areas, and ISW says so plainly, which is why I trust both of them more than I'd trust either one alone. Now hold that number next to the same month last year, June 2025, 68 casualties per square kilometer. 68 to 1,298. Same war, same army, 12 months apart. That's not a line breaking, that's a price changing, and prices, eventually, get paid by somebody. Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service counterpart in Kyiv reported on July 12th that the Russian Defense Ministry has recruited about 195,000 contract soldiers so far in 2026. The annual target is 409,000. They're not at half. Daily recruitment has slipped from roughly 1,200 men a day in 2024 to about 1,090 now, and the standards are going the other way. Medical requirements relaxed, students courted, foreigners courted, residents of occupied territory courted. ISW's assessment is blunt about the crossover point. Russia's casualty rate overtook its recruitment rate in March of this year. March. That's 4 months of running a deficit on the one input that can't be manufactured, imported, or subsidized. There's a version of this where I tell you that means the army is about to shatter. I'm not going to. Armies don't work like spreadsheets, and Russia has options. A compulsory mobilization it has spent 4 years avoiding is still sitting there, unused, politically expensive but available. What the number means is narrower and more interesting. The machine that has been feeding this offensive is running on stored capital, and stored capital has a bottom. Which brings me back to Salavat. Understand what Ukraine has actually been doing since March, because drone attacks on refineries undersells it to the point of distortion. Ukraine has been working through the Russian refining system methodically, plant by plant, and going after one specific category of equipment: primary crude distillation units. Not the tank farms, not the loading racks, the units that split incoming crude into the feedstocks everything else depends on. At Salavat, they damaged AVT-6, and satellite imagery reviewed the next day suggested AVT-4 took hits as well. At Omsk, Russia's largest refinery, more than 2,000 kilometers from the front, they reportedly damaged ELOU-AVT-11 and AVT-10. Saratov stopped after a March strike. Kirishi lost capacity in March and again in May. Norsy and Kstovo has been hit repeatedly. You cannot improvise around a wrecked distillation column. You can't route around it with clever logistics. It's a large, precise, slow-to-build piece of industrial hardware, much of it originally supplied by firms that no longer sell to Russia, and the queue for a replacement is measured in quarters, not weeks. The Kropotnya refinery outside Moscow, the largest fuel supplier to the entire Moscow region, was hit twice, and according to officials speaking to Reuters, will be offline until at least the end of this year. Roughly a third of Russia's domestic refining capacity is down. 8 of the country's 10 largest refineries have been struck since March. Russian gasoline output is running at about 65% of what the country normally consumes at this time of year. 65%. In a petrostate. Here's where it stops being an energy story and becomes a governance story. Russia has banned the export of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. A country that built its modern state on selling hydrocarbons is now hoarding refined product it can't produce enough of. It's importing gasoline from Belarus, 141,000 tons in the first 25 days of June alone, 2.4 times what it took in across all of May. It brought in at least 60,000 tons from India. Reuters reported Moscow was shopping for roughly 400,000 tons a month from foreign suppliers. Russia is buying gasoline made from Russian crude, sold back to it at a markup, by the customers it sold the crude to. As of late June, 55 of Russia's 83 federal regions had restrictions on fuel sales, either government-mandated or imposed by the stations themselves. Drivers in Chita reportedly waited 39 hours. In Krasnodar, teachers were assigned shifts at filling stations to manage the queues. Some stations stopped selling to the public entirely and reserved what they had for government and emergency vehicles. And then, on July 14th, the detail that tells you how the Kremlin reads its own situation. 3 sources inside Russian regional and federal government told the opposition outlet Verstka that federal authorities have banned regional governors from independently securing fuel for their own populations. Governors can distribute what Moscow allocates them. That's it. No side deals, no private arrangements, no going out and solving your own region's problem. Think about what that instinct reveals. If you believed the shortage was temporary and manageable, you'd let governors scramble, let them find barrels wherever they can, take the political credit, move on. You only centralize allocation when the pie is small enough that letting people fight over it produces a picture you can't control. That's not a supply decision. That's a decision about who gets to see the shortage. Now, deep breath, because the next part is where most of the coverage goes wrong, and I want to be precise about it, because getting this wrong will cost you money if you trade on it. Brent settled at $84.95 on Wednesday. WTI closed at $79.60. Brent touched above 86 intraday, its highest in about a month. And almost none of that is Ukraine. That move is Iran. U.S. Central Command ran a 7-hour operation against dozens of Iranian military assets along the coast and near the Strait of Hormuz, hitting missile and drone facilities, naval assets, coastal defenses. Washington reinstated its naval blockade of Iranian ports near the strait. Trump pledged to keep going until Tehran stops attacking vessels and reopens the waterway, and separately dropped a proposed 20% fee on cargo transiting Hormuz, saying Gulf investment into the U.S. would more than cover the lost revenue. The Revolutionary Guard claims it hit 2 tankers. ADNOC confirmed 2 vessels were struck. That's the crude story. Hormuz moves crude. It has moved crude all year, violently, in both directions. The Russia story shows up somewhere else entirely, and if you only watch the Brent screen, you will miss it completely. It shows up in the spread between crude and the fuel refined from it. On July 8th, the NYMEX 321 crack spread, the standard measure of what an American refiner earns turning 3 barrels of crude into 2 of gasoline and 1 of diesel, hit a record. $64.58 a barrel. Record. In Europe, diesel refining margins broke $60 a barrel, also a record, right after Russia announced it was halting diesel exports. European gasoline hit a 4-year high premium over crude at $41 a barrel. Crude fell. Fuel didn't. That gap is the whole story, and that gap is Ukraine. Because here's the thing about global diesel. Russia was one of the largest reliable suppliers of it on Earth. Take that supply out, and everyone who used to buy it goes shopping in the same 3 places at once: the U.S. Gulf Coast, India, the Middle East. Buyers in Brazil, Africa, and Turkey are now bidding against each other for the same replacement barrels. U.S. distillate inventories are near 5-year lows, around 103.6 million barrels, roughly 12% under the 5-year seasonal average. Gasoline stocks are about 6% under. American refineries ran at 95.8% utilization in the week ending July 3rd, essentially flat out, no slack left, no idle capacity to cover the next unplanned outage. So who wins and who pays? Refiners win. Obviously, spectacularly, and for as long as this lasts. Margins well over double where they sat before the Iran war started, earned while crude prices were actually falling, which is the rarest and most profitable configuration in that business. If you own a refiner right now, you are in the middle of the best environment the sector has seen in years, and the reason has less to do with Texas than with a distillation column in Bashkortostan. You pay. Specifically, you pay at the pump and then you pay again in everything that moves on a truck. AAA's national gasoline average hit $3.88 on July 10th, up 6 cents in a single week, the largest weekly jump since mid-May. Trading Economics has wholesale gasoline holding above $3.20 a gallon, near its highest since late May, and EIA data showed U.S. gasoline stocks falling another 1.5 million barrels in the week ending July 10th. The EIA's short-term energy outlook, published July 7th, forecast third-quarter retail gasoline just under $3.80, down from over $4.20 in the second quarter, and it got there by assuming Brent averages $74 this quarter. Brent closed at 85 yesterday. That forecast is already carrying a substantial assumption gap, and the EIA said in the same document that falling crude would be partly offset by rising crack spreads. They just didn't model crack spreads hitting a record. Meanwhile, the president is publicly telling retailers to aim for $2.50 a gallon. Take a look at the distance between $2.50 and $3.88, and then take a look at who actually sets that number, not retailers. Gas stations clear something like 10 to 15 cents of net profit on a gallon, whether it sells for $2.50 or $4. The money is upstream: crude suppliers, refiners, taxes. Which means the thing standing between American drivers and cheaper gasoline this summer is partly a war zone in the Persian Gulf and partly a drone campaign over Bashkortostan, and neither of those responds to a phone call. And diesel is the one to actually watch, because diesel isn't a consumer product. Diesel is a cost of goods sold. It's freight, it's rail, it's agriculture, it's construction, it's every pallet of anything that reaches a shelf. When diesel cracks go to record highs, and U.S. stocks sit 12% below the seasonal average heading into harvest season, that's not a pump price story. That's a slow-moving input cost story that shows up in earnings calls in the fall and in the goods component of inflation prints after that. The Fed doesn't cut for a headline. It might hesitate for a trend in freight costs. And the timing is what makes me uneasy. American refiners are already flat out. There is no reserve capacity to bring online, no button to press. The thing that usually rescues a tight fuel market is somebody, somewhere, deciding to run harder, and everybody who can run harder already is. Analysts at Sparta Commodities put it plainly last week. The supply relief traders are penciling in may not arrive at all. Russian barrels have vanished from the market. Chinese export volumes are uncertain, and the Middle East just reopened as a live risk instead of a resolved one. 3 separate assumptions, all of them load-bearing, all of them wobbling in the same week. Now let me close a loop I opened earlier, because there's a number in all this that seems to contradict everything I've said. Russia's seaborne crude exports averaged 4.13 million barrels a day over the 4 weeks through June 28th. That's the highest 4-week rate since early 2022. Russia is exporting more crude than it has in over 4 years. So how is this a crisis? Because that's not strength. That's what a broken refinery looks like from the outside. If you can't process your own crude, you have 2 choices. Shut in the wells, which damages them and is politically unthinkable, or shove the barrels onto boats and sell them raw at whatever the market pays. Russia chose the boats. And the boats are backed up. Nearly 135 million barrels of Russian crude are sitting on the water right now, unsold or in transit, floating inventory that exists because the refineries that were supposed to absorb it are dark. Russia's 4-week crude export revenue actually fell by about $200 million to roughly $1.68 billion a week, even at that record volume, because Urals discounts widened and prices came off their Iran war highs. China and India together account for around 1.8 million barrels a day of identified purchases. Another 1.9 million barrels a day shows up in tanker tracking data as unknown destination. More volume, less money, fewer real customers. That's not an export boom. That's a distress sale with a fleet attached. And Ukraine is attacking the fleet too. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander reported on July 14th that Ukrainian forces hit 5 tankers, 5 dry cargo ships, and a tugboat in the Sea of Azov overnight. 116 vessels struck since July 6th alone. Ukraine's Navy says it sank an FSB border guard ship, the Izumrud, near Novorossiysk with an unmanned surface vessel. Russia's transport ministry is publicly reassuring people about cargo logistics. Its agriculture ministry is publicly reassuring people that grain exports are fine. When 2 ministries independently announce that everything is fine, that is generally the least reliable information available to you that day. In occupied Crimea, Ukrainian strikes on the Balaklava thermal plant left part of Sevastopol on a rolling blackout schedule. The head of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis reported that small and medium businesses and farms have simply stopped working, livestock and poultry operations doing by hand what machines used to do, because there's no power and no fuel. Ukrainian intelligence reported on July 10th that Russian farmers are warning of a reduced harvest because they can't get diesel for the equipment. Fuel, electricity, freight, harvest. That's not 4 separate problems. That's one problem, wearing 4 coats. So let me give you the honest counter-argument because it exists and it's serious. Russian doctrine has always contained the idea of elastic defense, deliberately trading ground to preserve force, stretch an attacker's supply lines, and set up a counterstroke later. Ukraine's own gains right now are not a breakthrough, and nobody serious is calling them one. ISW itself assessed back in March that Ukraine's localized counterattacks were unlikely to develop into a general counteroffensive, and that Russia would probably stabilize and resume attacking. That assessment has held up. Russia is still advancing in Sumy, still grinding at Kostiantynivka, still pushing near Slovyansk. 126 square kilometers is real, and it is also about the size of a mid-sized American city, in a war fought across a country the size of Texas. Ukrainian claims of a 25-kilometer pushback almost certainly describe the whole operation since January, not this week. Refineries get repaired. Bans expire. Russia's diesel export ban could lapse on July 31st. The IEA's own longer-range outlook projects global supply expanding by 7.5 million barrels a day in 2027, which would turn this year's shortage into next year's glut. All of that is true. Hold it. Don't throw it away for a better story. But notice what the counter-argument doesn't touch. Elastic defense explains giving up ground. It doesn't explain refining runs at a 21-year low. It doesn't explain buying gasoline from Belarus and India. It doesn't explain 135 million barrels floating because there's nowhere to put them. It doesn't explain banning your own governors from helping their own people. And it doesn't explain the casualty ratio going from 68 to 1,298 per square kilometer in 12 months, while your recruitment falls short of target by more than half. Elastic defense is a choice. Most of that list isn't. A general can decide to give up a village. No general decides to lose a distillation column. There's one more piece moving, and it's in Washington and Paris rather than Bashkortostan. A bipartisan group of U.S. senators has introduced a revised Russia sanctions bill targeting Moscow's energy revenues while preserving presidential waiver authority, which is the detail that tells you it's designed to pass rather than to make a point. In Paris on July 13th, 10 countries and Ukraine signed on to an integrated anti-ballistic missile coalition. France and Italy granted Ukraine production licenses for glide bombs, Scalp cruise missiles, and Aster 30 interceptors. Ukraine placed an initial order for 16 Rafale fighters against a stated 100. And on the night of July 13th, Ukraine shot down 5 of 8 incoming ballistic missiles, after downing 0 across the previous 5 Russian strike packages that included ballistics. 0 to 5 out of 8, in one night. Because Ukraine's Patriot interceptor stocks had been depleted, and Russia had been exploiting exactly that. So here's where I land, and I want to be careful because the temptation is to declare something. Russia is not retreating on 4 fronts. Russia's front line is not collapsing. What is happening is that the 2 things Russia needs to keep this war going, men and refined fuel, are both being consumed faster than they can be replaced, while the ground being purchased with them shrinks toward nothing. 97 square kilometers in 6 months, 14 years to finish the stated objective. 195,000 recruits against a target of 409,000. Refining at 2005 levels. That's real strain. It is not collapse. The difference between those 2 words is enormous, and almost everyone covering this will spend it for you on a headline. The market has already priced the Iran half of the story. Every trader on Earth can see a naval blockade. The Russian half is priced into something almost nobody outside the energy desks watches. The gap between what crude costs and what fuel costs, sitting at a record, refusing to close, quietly transferring money from every American with a truck to a handful of refiners with functioning distillation units. Which leaves me with the question I can't answer, and I'd rather admit it than fake it. Russia can keep exporting crude for years. It can't refine it. So what does a petrostate become when it can still pump but can no longer process, when it has to buy its own gasoline back from the people it sold the oil to, and ration what's left, and forbid its governors from mentioning the shortfall out loud? Does that country negotiate? Or does it discover that the only asset it has left to spend is the one thing it was already spending fastest? This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.